Hello and welcome. My name is Brittany Proctor, and I'm a licensed professional counselor and chemical dependency counselor here at the VC Counseling Center.
And my name is Madison. I'm a licensed professional counselor associate at the VC Counseling Center.
So today we are tackling imposter syndrome, which I feel like is a really great topic for us to tackle because, first of all, how common it is. So common, in fact, personally speaking, I can speak from personal experience that I have struggled with imposter syndrome both in grad school and then early out of graduation as well. Let's start with the definition first, though, so you know what we're talking about here. So imposter syndrome can be defined as a persistent feeling of self-doubt and fear of being exposed as a fraud, despite evidence that you are doing well. I think this is the key point here is that, for example, taking myself as an example, in grad school, constant feelings of self-doubt, like I'm not good enough, I don't belong here, despite objective evidence, like A's in class, hundreds on assignments, that I am doing well, there was still that nagging feeling that I'm not doing well, or that I don't know what I'm talking about, or that I don't know what's happening in here. And I think that's something important to highlight is that even though you're doing well, if you're failing your classes and you're feeling like you're not doing well, the fact is you're probably not doing well. But with imposter syndrome, there's evidence that we are doing well, but we feel like we don't belong.
Piggyback off of that, whenever we have imposter syndrome, there is that evidence that we are very smart and capable of doing great things, but yet there's still that little voice in the back of our head that's saying, I don't belong here. I don't know what I'm doing. And people are going to eventually pick up on that and call me out. And that's extremely scary.
And I think that's a good addition to that fear of being found out. That it's not just that I feel this way, it's also that other people are going to become aware that I'm not doing well or that I'm not good at this at the end of the day. And a big part of this is self-esteem and just feeling some other common thoughts, just I don't belong here. They made a mistake when they accepted me. Everyone else is smarter than me in some way. So it's basically that feeling of kind of looking around your classroom, feeling like everyone else is super intelligent or capable or catching on to something. And like you're the only person in the room that's struggling and no one knows that. And these thoughts are kind of what drive all of the behaviors of imposter syndrome, which, like you were saying, Madison, for a lot of us are like low self-esteem or self-doubt or negative thoughts about ourselves, and even sometimes failure or dropping out or giving up on things because we convince ourselves that we don't belong or we don't deserve this in some way.
Definitely. And since, our thoughts are tied to our emotions and our behaviors, it can really have a huge impact on our mental health. So it's something that's really important to, be educated about and just understand what's going on because it's so much more common than we expect.
And I think that's the craziest thing too, is just how common it is, even when people don't realize. And especially, Madison has some neat, well, I don't want to say neat because it's also not that cool, but some facts about imposter syndrome. Feel free.
Some not so fun facts. So yeah, imposter syndrome, it often affects high achieving students, female students, first generation college students, Black, Indigenous, person of colors, and those in competitive programs.
So most of the students that exist
Yeah,
on our campus and in general in the world. And, we could talk about kind of like how and why, but ultimately, I think it kind of makes sense, right? Like if you're already a high achieving person, you're more likely to doubt yourself and to have thoughts that lead to imposter syndrome. If you are a female student, especially in a male dominated program, you're more likely to doubt yourself because you are the only woman there trying to prove yourself. And same thing, like even for the inverse, right? If nursing is a great example, if I'm the only male identifying student in a room full of nursing students, it kind of makes sense to kind of doubt my place here because it's, I look around and it's like, do I really belong here? So another fact about imposter syndrome is that 70% of millennials report experiencing imposter syndrome, which is, like we said, once again, a very high percentage. This is not an uncommon issue.
For sure. And another fact is that 82% of academic faculty report experiencing imposter syndrome.
Yes, the very professors that we look up to and think have their lives all figured out have my favorite story. I don't know if she would mind me telling this story, but I had a professor who was my mentor in my graduate program, and I thought she was the coolest thing ever. Like, she had several kids. They all knew different languages. She taught her children to be fluent in 5 different languages. She had traveled all over the world. She had lived basically everywhere, gotten her PhD in England. She was so brilliant and amazing, and I was like, this woman is perfect. Like, everything about her, she is everything I want to be. And like, it resulted in like some impostery feelings, right? That like, I'm not that person. I struggle with English sometimes, let's be real, and like, I'm never going to be that. And yeah, she was the same professor that a month into classes, we had to stop class and we had to help her operate PowerPoint because she couldn't operate PowerPoint. But these are the things, though, is that no one's perfect. And, even the people that we think are perfect and don't struggle with anything, and the people that we look up to and say, like, man, they really have their life figured out. I wish I had my life figured out like them. Ultimately, those people are people too.
It sounds like you got to see more of her human side.
I did. And it was okay. So 72% of individuals with imposter syndrome also report experiencing anxiety, which I think makes sense. These two kind of go hand in hand. Anxiety usually has a lot of worry, and it has a lot of doubt, and it has a lot of fears. And imposter syndrome is also rooted in all of those things, right?
So, among nursing students, imposter syndrome significantly correlates with depression, stress, and anxiety.
And while we, pick on nursing students here, this is not unique to nursing students in the slightest. I feel like nursing is a really hard major in the sense that it's very course heavy, and there's a lot of outside work, and your coursework starts taking up the entirety of your life. And I feel like when we put all of our eggs in one basket in that way, where like my classwork is the only thing that I'm doing right now because I have to, I feel like sometimes for some people it can lead us to struggle a little bit more with imposter syndrome because we only have one role or thing in our life right now. And women in STEM fields also report the highest levels of imposter syndrome.
And that makes sense because, as you were talking about earlier, usually STEM fields are dominated by men. So, women in those fields definitely can kind of doubt their place. And, that can contribute to those feelings of self doubt for sure.
Yeah.
So, now it's time for us to talk about some of the mental health impacts that are associated with imposter syndrome. One being anxiety. So, anxiety can definitely play a role when it comes to imposter syndrome because whenever we experience such intense fears of failure and we're constantly worrying about being called out as a fraud, we're going to experience some really high levels of anxiety. It's feeling like a constant threat, to us and to our competence. Additionally, whenever we fear that failure, it can cause us to avoid opportunities that may help us grow and improve. We get that temporary comfort of staying in our comfort zone, but every time a new opportunity comes up, we find ourselves becoming even more and more anxious since we are avoiding showing ourselves that we can take on new challenges.
Yeah, and I think a great example of that too can even be like not applying for a specific job because you're doubting yourself of, oh, that's a really nice company. Like, for, I don't know, Apple, for example. I feel like most people would be a little impostery about applying somewhere like Apple, right? There's going to be super smart people working there. They're definitely going to figure out that I don't know what I'm doing, or, I can never work there because they have such high expectations. And ultimately, like, you set the standards of your own life. You could do your best to rise to that challenge. Or, like Madison, you said, let the imposter syndrome take over and talk yourself out of even trying in the first place because it's so intimidating to try rather than trusting yourself, what you've learned, your knowledge, who you are as a human being, and your ability to like get through things for sure.
Additionally, imposter syndrome can contribute to depression. So, whenever we are experiencing frequent self doubt, that can contribute to depressive symptoms such as decreased self esteem, feelings of worthlessness, can even cause us to lose interest in some enjoyable activities. Another portion that adds to that depression is whenever we engage in self comparison, because that can fuel those depressive symptoms and contribute to a negative self perception.
I feel like I did that a lot in grad school. Like, I would look at everyone else in the class and assume that they all knew a lot more than me, or that they all came from other states, so they must be smarter than me, right? Because those two things are definitely related. But I convinced myself of this, so it was hard to even make friends in grad school because I had already made up my mind that everybody else was better than me. And so I didn't reach out when I needed help. I didn't ask for help with assignments. I basically did most of it alone out of my own like doing because I made up my mind that I wasn't good enough, which led me to not be around anyone else. when ultimately I started connecting with others, I realized they also had no idea what they were doing and were just as terrified. And then we could like share that and bond over it, which felt much nicer than feeling like me alone was awful and not good enough and all of these negative things, which were totally not true. But, your brain has a crazy way of convincing you otherwise.
For sure. So, imposter syndrome can also contribute to burnout. So, the idea that this stems from is that we're chasing perfection, right? You know, whenever we're succumbing ourselves to imposter syndrome. So, when we're chasing this perfection, we can drain our mental and physical, well being. Chronic stress can contribute to that burnout, and that can show up as emotional exhaustion, feeling detached from others, a reduced sense of accomplishment. Additionally, whenever we experience imposter syndrome, we find ourselves over preparing and overworking ourselves, which can exacerbate the stress and burnout and contribute to a lack of balance and boundaries between, our work life, our academics, and our personal life.
I'm glad that you brought up the perfectionism because I feel like that's a really key part of imposter syndrome is, not even necessarily perfectionism, but just the expectations that we hold for ourselves of what we should be, how life should be, how these things should play out, or how we should be, or how other people should perceive us. I mean, but I really like the idea of perfectionism because it does. Perfectionism ties in a lot with imposter syndrome. Even if we don't recognize that's what we're striving for, ultimately it is. Like you're asking yourself to be this perfect person, not knowing anything. You're in school because you don't know something. You're in school to learn something at the end of the day. And that's everyone in the class. Like if someone was an expert in something, they're not going to take a class. I'm not going to spend thousands of dollars to take a class in something that I'm
Right.
already an expert in. You know what I mean?
So, with you discussing your, personal example of isolation, it sounds like you really made yourself an outsider in grad school, for a good portion of time. But once you actually got to talking with your classmates, you recognized that this is a really common experience. I'm not the only one that's feeling this way. And hopefully that can, brought y'all together, allowed you to make more friends and branch out rather than withdrawing
Are
from
you
the group.
therapizing me right now?
Possibly.
No, that's fine. And I feel like imposter syndrome is kind of different for each person that experiences it. And it's important to reflect on these things, not as like, someone's diagnosing you, because it's definitely not what we're doing here. We're simply discussing a concept that's really common for a lot of people to hopefully normalize it so that hopefully you can, if you do identify with some of these traits, you can kind of, at least if anything, get the understanding that it's absolutely something everyone struggles with. I mean, even both of us therapists at the same time. I mean, it's such a common experience. People just don't talk about it very much. So a lot of times when we have imposter syndrome, it facilitates this constant pressure that we have to overachieve to earn our place in what we're doing. Um, it can lead to this internal, this idea that people in power positions have everything figured out, that like we were talking about earlier, that, my professors definitely have life figured out, or my supervisor definitely is this robot of a human being that is just, amazing. When in reality, like I said earlier, we're all humans. Take it from a therapist. Everyone struggles. Everyone has hardships. No one is perfect. Absolutely no one is perfect. I cannot say that enough.
I think another kind of point to touch on with that is since we have this pressure to prove ourselves, we have to do so, or else our worst fears are confirmed. So we do everything in our power to make sure that failure isn't an option, right? So that can look like studying endlessly for tests, giving up your personal life and hobbies, maybe even your sense of identity and self-worth becomes tied to your achievements, when in reality something that we try and talk about in therapy is just that our self-worth is inherent, meaning it's a basic or permanent part of someone regardless of our accomplishments.
Yeah, you have worth as a human because you exist. You don't have to prove that. There's nothing that you have to do to make that real. You just have value for being you ultimately. And these other parts of your life are things that you do because you want to do or because they make you happy, not necessarily because you have to be worth it to someone or something. So a lot of times whenever I see students that do struggle with imposter syndrome, one of their biggest questions is, why is this happening now? Like, why has this never been an issue for me before? When in reality, most of the time, the more like exploring that we do, the more we realize it's been an issue, right? So like we talked about earlier, people who overachieve as a habit, just they're hardwired to be overachievers, typically overachieve in grade school too, and it leads up into college. And then when we get to college, the imposter thoughts really start becoming noticeable for people. But it's also simply because, when we're surrounded by our peers and we have so many people to compare ourselves to, it becomes really easy to compare ourselves, and it can become automatic to just compare all the time to people in our class, especially when we're doing something we actually enjoy. Like if you're in your certificate program or in your EMT class or in your CNA class, and you're having to learn the things that you care about. When other people seem to know more than you, it can be really threatening. And so we start turning it on ourselves. And same thing too, we're in new environments that's going to challenge, who we think we are and our ability to be competent. You may have been the top student at your high school, but suddenly you get to college and there are lots of top students in that same class with you. So everyone's really smart now, and that can be scary. And even on top of that, too, thinking about when I look around the room, like we were talking with gender or BIPOC students, if I look around the room and I don't see other people like me, that can lead to me feeling out of place and like I'm not good enough, or how did I get here, and start triggering some of those thoughts for people for sure. So the next section is coping. So we're going to briefly talk about coping. This is not therapy. This is not us telling you what to do, but I thought this would be fun for the end of these videos for me and Madison to go through as two separate therapists who, yes, we work together. And yes, I supervise Madison to a degree, like as a licensed counselor, but ultimately, how do we encourage students? What are some of our favorite coping skills to use with students whenever they present with this issue? So we'll kind of ping pong back and forth with this. So I'll start. So one of my favorite ways to teach students to cope with this is this like name it to tame it strategy, right? So learning about what imposter syndrome is, learning about what it looks like. And then when you do have imposter thoughts or feelings, simply naming them, saying those are imposter-based thoughts, brain. I do not appreciate those, and we are working to not have imposter-based thoughts. So just kind of naming them for what they are sometimes can take power away from them.
For sure. I feel like my first, tip here is kind of similar to that. And it's just about becoming more aware of those thoughts that you're having and learning to challenge them rather than just accept them. Asking yourself what situations is the imposter syndrome showing up most, identifying those unhelpful thoughts and challenging them. So some good questions are, what's the evidence for and against this? Am I making assumptions? Is there any alternative explanations to help me understand why this thought is going on for me? Is this fact or feeling? And lastly, what's a more helpful and realistic way of looking at this? All of these are great questions to help challenge those thoughts that we're experiencing.
And I love that because you stole my second point right out of
Oops.
my mouth. Thought challenging. Don't you hate it when therapists like do the same thing all the time? Because yes, thought challenging is a very common therapeutic tool. But there's a reason for it. It's because it works really well for most people. Not every people, but most people. So yeah, and mine was just reality checking your thoughts. So asking yourself, like, what evidence do I really have that it is true that I do not belong here? Well, I feel that way. Feelings are not facts. I hate to break it to you, but just because I feel something doesn't make it an absolute fact. So kind of making it like a courtroom, right? I need evidence. I need evidence that you are a failure. What hard evidence would pass a court of law? So yeah, same thing. My next one would be talking to and or identifying a mentor. Kind of like the story that I told earlier, right? The more that I got to know my mentor, the more I realized she was very much a human being that very much had flaws and also struggled just as much as I did, if not more, just with slightly different things. So this can be really helpful for you. And this goes against the isolation too, right? If I'm reaching out to people and identifying someone that I look up to talk to about these things, a lot of times you'll realize that everyone struggles with it and they'll say, oh my God, me too. I also feel like an imposter here.
For sure. It definitely helps normalize that imposter syndrome and shows you it's more common than you think. And also, I think another benefit of talking to people outside of just going based off of your thoughts is that it helps you kind of get some outside perspective, and they can highlight your strengths and accomplishments that maybe you're struggling to see yourself, which is huge because it's so easy for us to kind of discount that positive feedback, discount that A+ on our exam. But whenever we actually have other people who are like, hey, you're doing a really great job, and here's some evidence of that, that's huge for us whenever we're experiencing those negative thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. And, I also feel like it's not infallible either because compliments make me really uncomfortable. I don't know about you, but I hate it when people like point at me and be like, good job, Brittany. It makes me so uncomfortable. That's a different issue for a different day. But yes, other people acknowledging that like objectively you are doing your job and you're doing it objectively well can definitely be helpful. And I have a new point that does not overlap with Madison, and that is kind of a two-part thing, right? We want to first of all not only strive for perfection and recognize when we are, and then ground ourselves of you're never going to be perfect, and that's okay. And celebrating the progress too, not just perfection. So being able to say, no, I did not pass my final with the grade that I wanted, but I did still make an A overall in the class, and that is still objectively a good thing, or whatever it might be. And then also recognizing when I have perfection based expectations and acknowledging that that is unrealistic. So being able to notice in the moment, hey, I am holding a perfectionistic view of what I need to be right now. I am holding myself to an unreasonable standard, and being able to notice that in the moment and then diffusing it. A lot of times that helps people more than anything, diffusing those thoughts.
For sure. Another thing I like to talk about with students who are experiencing imposter syndrome is the idea of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. So, a fixed mindset is whenever individuals believe that their abilities and intelligence is something that they're born with, and it typically can't be changed. On the other hand, the growth mindset allows individuals to believe that their abilities and intelligence can be developed through effort and learning. So that allows people to embrace their challenges and see failure as an opportunity for learning. So it can be helpful to ask yourself questions like, what went well? What can I learn from this? And how can this experience better prepare me for next time? Rather than letting our failures define us and take such a huge toll on us, these questions can be really helpful.
Yeah, no, and I like those too because they're very like concrete. Like it gives you something to work on of recognizing when being a little bit more flexible in your thinking, which can definitely be hard. And then my last point is the simple statement that just because you feel like an imposter does not mean that you are one. And sometimes that can be really powerful to recognizing, like I said earlier, just because I think something does not make it a fact. Thoughts are just thoughts. Ultimately, I, as my rational self, decide what is a fact based off of evidence. And just because I feel that way doesn't mean I actually am that way. So, do you have more points?
I have one more.
Okay.
I think another huge thing is just showing ourselves self compassion whenever we're experiencing imposter syndrome and these thoughts. A good question to ask yourself is, what would I say to my best friend if they were going through this? There's so many times whenever we can be there for our friends who are going through something difficult, but when it comes to us, we're so critical, and it's just such a huge difference.
So hateful to
We
ourselves.
are.
Yes.
So asking yourself, what would I tell my best friend? Those are typically the words that you need to hear most during those moments of imposter syndrome. Some examples can be, I'm doing my best, and that's all that matters. I'm learning and growing, and that's a good thing. And then also just reminding yourself, I am not alone. Many people experience these feelings.
70%, in fact,
70%.
of just
Many
college
people.
students, for starters. But yes. No, and I love that point. And I think that's a really great place to end to, even on that very uplifting and positive note. But if you do feel like imposter syndrome is something that you struggle with and you want to talk it out, that is also what we're here for. So you can always feel free to stop by the counseling center, give us a call, email, or just pop in for walk-in hours, either one. But yeah, so this has been Brittany
And Madison.
and thank you guys so much for listening.